Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by Infinite Red. Episode 175, State Management in React Native.
Hey everyone, welcome to React Native Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Jamin Holmgren, and with me today are two of my co-hosts, Robin Hyatt. Say hi, Robin.
Hello, everyone.
And Harris Robin Kalash.
Hey.
Aditi is not with us today. She's unavailable, but she will be back for future episodes. Can't wait to have her back. This episode is, we don't have a guest this episode, but we do have a really fun topic. Well, fun if you're a nerd like me. I love this topic. I gotta admit. This topic is going to be about state management in React Native. We'll probably talk a little bit about state management in React as well, web. But it's going to be primarily around React Native, given the topic of this podcast. So we're going to talk about state management libraries. We're going to talk about our experience working within each of these libraries, kind of our opinions around it, and also just kind of speculate a little bit about the future and what state management might look like in the future of React Native. I should mention that this episode is sponsored by my company, Infinite Red, and definitely check us out if you want any, of course, React Native work done. Infinite.red is our domain. You can email me directly, jamin@infinite.red, if you have any questions at all. So without any further ado, let's just dive into this. First off, I want to ask my co-podcasters here, what is state management? Let's just start at the basics.
State management, in any application where, especially in a client-side application where you have UI and a user interacting with it, you need to be able to manage the state of the world of that application, right? In a single place, ideally. It just allows you to manage, like, what is the current world state of my application? Is the menu open, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, Harris. It's like if you had, like one of those hamburger buttons that opens a side menu, a drawer menu. Is that menu open or is it closed? That's the state of it. That's what it is. There are many different ways to approach this. This has been a problem, or maybe not a problem, but it's been a thing in software development since the very beginning. Robin, do you have anything to add to what you might define state management as?
Yeah, I read in a blog post a while back, and I wish I could remember who the author was. So apologies to whoever wrote that blog post. But it was that state is a record of everything the user has done since opening the app.
Very interesting.
So if they've opened a drawer or loaded a list of data from an API, that is all captured in state as a data object.
That's a really good way to say it. And in fact, I don't know if anybody listening to this podcast is as old as me, but way back when I was a kid, we had a car, I think it was a station wagon, that had a radio, and the presets, you could push the preset button in, like on the radio, to switch to a different preset, and the button would stay in, the one that you were on. So it'd be like, click this button, it would click out any others that were currently pushed, and it would pop over to the other one. So you'd be like, oh, now I'm on 750 news radio, and you could set those, and that whichever one was pushed in was the state. You could also look at the dial and see where the needle was and say, okay, that's the state. That's the station that I'm on, as being kind of like, that's my state. And like you said, Robin, that reflects what the user has done up to that point, because radio would just be on, whatever the default was if I didn't push the button. But obviously we're talking about software here, and specifically React Native. And when I did native mobile app development, it was kind of interesting. I came from a Rails background, like Robin, you did, and state often, like in web development, especially when I did PHP, state was like reconstructed every single page load in the very beginning. So you would just go into your database and say, okay, hey, here's like a cookie, with a session token or something. Who's currently logged in? Okay, now that we know who's logged in, grab all of their current state, a bunch of different things. Plus, a certain amount of state would be held in the URL. Like what page are they on? What are they trying to do? Maybe there's like a post action, so now we know what they're trying to do. So state was kind of scattered in a couple different places. One of the big changes when I moved to mobile development, native mobile development, was that state was it was more stateful. It was like the variables would live on for longer, like sit in an object, and if you had a drawer, you could just have like a class variable that would just track, am I open or am I closed? That took a little different approach.
I think one thing that made a big change in sort of that paradigm is sort of we used to have fat servers and thin clients, right? So now we have fat clients and thin servers. So where servers are ideally stateless, right? And really all the state is on the client side. And that's why like state management solutions today are much more important, just because the client side has gotten so much more complicated than before, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's totally true. And that there are reasons for that. There are reasons why, we're pushing more and more over to the client. There's some resistance to that. There's some like kind of throwback now to like, can we put stuff back on the server? I know Phoenix with Elixir, Phoenix has like Phoenix Live View, which will hold all the state server side and then push things to the client. But for the most part, when you're building a React app or you're building a React Native app, most of your state is living client side in your browser or in your app. So there have been various approaches to this since React came out. I remember in the very beginning, Facebook, when they published React, also kind of came out with this thing. It was called Flux. It was like the Flux pattern. It wasn't so much a library, but it was more like a pattern of unidirectional data flow. Sorry, were you going to say that?
Yeah,
Robin?
that's what I was going to say.
Okay. And it was pretty confusing. And I don't think, Robin, you were working in React at that time.
No, I was not. At that time, my idea of state management was active record.
Active record, exactly. And
in Rails.
In Rails, yeah. Yeah, and it was actually really confusing. They had these like charts, and like if you go look it up now, the charts have improved, the documentation has improved. But at the time, you looked at it and it was like, okay, here are a lot of new concepts. Here are a lot of things that I don't understand. Things like reducers and actions, and it was kind of introducing a bunch of new terminology. It was also kind of explained in a certain, it was just very kind of computer sciencey and less practical for me. So and at the time talking about like active record, when you would build a native app, you would use things like SQLite, which is a very simple database built right into iOS and Android. You could also do things like push things into core data on iOS, and you could, there were some other options there too. Of course, maintaining things in memory as well, but often state was just kind of scattered all throughout the application. And so when we went to React and they came up with the Flux pattern, it was an attempt to kind of centralize that state. We were using Ember at the time, and Ember has its own kind of way of, it was actually bidirectional data flow at that point in Ember. Yeah, that was on the website. And so we really didn't get into React until Redux had already taken hold. So Redux was invented, I think, or it was at least released in, I think, 2015, which was also the same year that React Native was released. And it quickly took over as the library and the pattern, because it was basically a simplified version of the Flux pattern, way simplified. It made sense. It was like more obvious. Still had some of the same kind of downsides and stuff like that. But it did, it implemented the Flux model. And so let's back up for a second. So we talked about like state being a record of everything that you've done in the app. So how does Redux, handle that?
Redux lets you. So Redux has like a single source of truth state tree. So you can think of it as like this giant object that represents the entire state of your application, and it lets you modify it by using reducers. So what you're essentially doing is that you're passing in the entire state, modifying modifying it and making a copy of it really as you modify it, and returning a whole new state every single time, which sounds very, very inefficient.
Okay, and let's just talk about the word reducer for a second. I mean, if I'm new to React or React Native and I see the word reducer, I just think reduce what?
Well,
it's just not an intuitive concept.
It's very true. It's I think in Elm, which was either inspired by Redux or inspired Redux. I don't remember which direction that went.
Elm inspired Redux.
Okay. So I did some Elm, and Elm calls them updates, I think. Like this is an update. That makes more sense to me. There's an update function, and you pass in the the state, like Harris said, and any actions that you want to do on that state, and then it returns back a whole new object that represents the state at that point. And then it has ways using Redux React to propagate those changes to the components that need to be updated.
One big selling point of Redux at the time, I remember, was always like this time traveling thing. It sounded really cool, but it comes down to, because you're modifying the state every time, and through an action, you're able to quickly implement like an undo. You're able to like go back in time in your state, basically, since your state changes over time and that's recorded, right? So
yeah, implementing undo where your state is just scattered into like this object and that object is actually pretty tough. And then conversely, if you save everything into a SQL database, unless you take advantage of databases, kind of inherent features of rollback and stuff like that, it can also be difficult because, like when did something change? How did it change? So Redux really kind of nailed that. It's like, okay, we know what the previous state was because we have the previous state structure. We can hang on to it. Like we're making new copies. So just hang on to the old one and you can roll back that change. So time travel, undo, redo, etc. It was pretty cool in Redux. And there are other other things there too, like action creators. So like I'm triggering an action, so I need to create an action, which isn't it kind of counterintuitively. An action is an object; it's not like an event. It's not a function call. You're passing an object through to your reducer, and then beyond that, you also have to think about side effects.
Side effects are events that are outside of the main flow of your application's functionality, and in turn, outside of your control.
Yep, that makes sense. And a good example of this would be like when you're calling out to an API. This is something that you don't control you control when it starts, but you don't control when it ends, and then how that is handled once it comes back. So you need some way to handle those side effects. So Redux has a few different ways of handling this. I think we tried thunks, which is like Redux thunks. It was a certain way of approaching it. Thunks are probably the simplest way, arguably, to handle side effects in Redux, but they also lack a certain amount of power. There's kind of like not really a way to handle multiple things happening in kind of just flowing through. Like we're gonna send out this API request, and then this other thing is going to happen, and we have to pop up a modal, and like all these things kind of happening in conjunction with each other. So we ended up moving to Redux Sagas, and that was the one that really stuck with us while we did Redux. Have either of you used Redux Sagas?
Yeah, so I obviously used Sagas at Infinite Red during that period, and I don't think I ever truly understood Sagas. It always just felt like there was a lot of boilerplate, and anytime you wanted to add a new saga, you had to add code in 4 different places to make it fire when you wanted it to fire. I just found sagas confusing.
Yeah.
It also gets confusing when you have to run other sagas in your sagas, and then it's like it's hard to keep track.
Yeah, and it kind of brings up sort of a broader theme within Redux, the complaint about boilerplate. Because boilerplate is kind of one of the things that when you first get into Redux, you're just like, wow, I'm touching a lot of files. I'm writing a lot of code just to do one thing. Now, I've heard it kind of, sort of described as Redux has sort of like a steep learning curve, but then once you're up kind of onto the plateau, then it's easy to scale applications up pretty much infinitely. So you can get to a pretty large application, and the way that you add any sort of event or state is pretty similar to how you did in the beginning. It's you're not having to kind of manage something that gets more and more unwieldy as time goes on. So that's sort of the trade-off there, is that it's like harder in the beginning, but easier as you scale, or at least that's kind of how it's sold.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and that's kind of a big deal. So let's kind of move on to some other options here. So at Infinite Red, we got a little bit tired of Redux. We did a few things. We created Redux sauce, which helps with there's a lot of kind of helpers and stuff like that to make Redux simpler. But once we got we had quite a few apps under our belt, probably 2 years worth of it, of building apps using Redux. We started looking for something else. And that's when we encountered MobX, but specifically MobX-State-Tree. And I gave a couple talks, actually 3 talks about MobX and MobX-State-Tree last year. And I'll just kind of in brief explain how they kind of work together. So MobX was created by Michel Weststrate. He now works at Facebook. He didn't before. And it's sort of a reactive engine that allows you to watch certain values. And when they change, it triggers functions. It just triggers like a watcher. You're observing values. It's very, very slick. It's a very, very small amount of code. At React Live Amsterdam, I actually watched Max Gallo. He re-implemented MobX and MobX React in like 50 lines of code on the stage. It was pretty impressive. It was a slightly naive version, but when I went and looked at the code that's actually under the hood in MobX and MobX React, it wasn't that much different. Like there was some additional edge cases and stuff that it handles, but it's a pretty simple system. But MobX by itself is pretty unstructured. So like, how do you use MobX? Well, how do you want to use it? And that's not usually like how programmers want to approach it. Yeah, like they want to have sort of a pattern, like what is the best way to do this? And so MobX-State-Tree kind of came out of that, and Michel created that. It makes MobX more like Redux in the good ways by creating kind of a global store and the ability to run actions, which are just functions, just methods, basically. And you can also create views, which are like computed, like you already have some properties in your or some data in your store, and you just want a different view of it. Maybe it's sorted a different way. Maybe it's filtered a certain way. Yeah,
I use views for things like if a user has a first and last name, I'll do a view called full name, or I'll use it for address formatting, really all sorts of things.
Exactly. The data's already there. You don't want to like store it as a full name property, but you just need to access it once in a while to output it in that way. So we use MobX-State-Tree, and then another thing called MobX React Lite. MobX React Lite, basically, you just wrap a component in a function called observer, and it will observe any properties that are accessed from your store and from your models in a component. And if those properties and only those properties change, it will re-render just that component or any that are observing that. And it makes it extremely performant. Now, there are some downsides to MobX and MobX-State-Tree and et cetera, but it's honestly extremely powerful just right out of the box.
Yeah, with MobX-State-Tree, you can get very far with just the basics. When you get into the more advanced features like middleware and lifecycle events, it gets quite a bit more complicated and also quite a bit more powerful, but you can get very far with just actions and properties and views.
Yeah. One thing I love about MobX is how clean it keeps your views. Like from my experience when using Redux, you always end up having views full of logic just because it's just much more effort to go ahead and like make that more dry. Like you have to go and implement selectors, and with MobX, it's just really easy. Like the computed views are right there. It just ties in well together.
Yeah, we're able to keep a lot of the business logic in models, which are infinitely more testable than views. So a lot of the logic that used to be in component classes, you can put in actions, which you can write unit tests for. So the separation of concerns is really nice.
Yeah, totally. And you kind of touched on it, but like, how does MobX-State-Tree handle side effects?
Yeah, so MobX-State-Tree uses flows, which are basically fancy async functions. Right. I think it's technically a wrapper around generator functions.
Yeah.
But it lets you make a call out to an external service, like an API, and wait for the result. That's something we're really already used to doing in JavaScript. We use promises all the time. So it's very intuitive.
Yeah, and you can use like async functions as an action. It would be more like...
Oh, I do all the time.
Yeah. And that's more like Redux thunks. That's like on the order of Redux thunks. You can do basically the same thing as Redux thunks there. But then there are some limitations, like you hit a certain point, and the way that code is sort of transformed starts making it a little more awkward to wait for things. You know, if you're waiting for multiple things, then you can't like manipulate properties directly and stuff like that. So when you do that, if you start hitting one of those limitations, you switch over to a flow, which is just like you wrap you make your function a generator function, which is basically just adding a star, like an asterisk to the function, and then you wrap it in a function called flow, which comes from MobX-State-Tree, and then within that, instead of doing a wait, you do yield, and it's not much different than that. Like, I don't really think there's anything else to it. I think that's the majority of what you do. And then it becomes basically like you just write it like you would, write a story. You're like, I want to yield, I want to wait for this call. And then when it comes back, I want to do this other thing. And you can even yield for things like I'm going to wait for, there's a function called wait, and you can wait for like a property in the model to change. So example, you can pop up a modal, and then when that modal closes, continue your action. You can just keep going, like in the middle of your action. It's kind of almost freaky, like it works this way.
Yeah, I guess it's good to note maybe that like you don't actually have to use Flow. I've actually never used it in any of my apps. I don't know. I've never really found it. Like I think maybe it makes the code a bit cleaner in certain cases, but I've never understood why I should use it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, totally. And by the way, we should mention this is not the flow that Facebook creates. That's like a TypeScript competitor, sort of static typing. We're talking about a function. It's literally just a function from MobX-State-Tree that you pull in called flow.
Yeah, and after 1-2 years of writing React Native apps with MobX-State-Tree, I think I've used Flow maybe once. I almost always just use regular async functions, which is even better because they're just functions. It's just JavaScript.
Yeah. So you don't have to create an action. You just call a function. You give it some properties.
Exactly. And it also just works really nicely in my brain because it's very object oriented, which calls back to my Rails days. I mean, you have model definition, and then you create a model instance, and you call functions and access properties directly on that object. So if like you have user and then user.load, it's very familiar. I
wish that Aditi was here because I think Aditi, she's used Redux a lot more. She probably would be able to provide a little different perspective on this. We have 3 MobX-State-Tree fans here. But with that said, what are some of the downsides to MobX-State-Tree? And I'll actually start by saying it's often kind of thought of as magic. Like, you don't see exactly what's happening. Redux is basically a pattern that there's sort of a library wrapped around it, but it's just a pattern. And so everything you're writing feels like, just normal JavaScript. Well, until you get into like sagas and thunks and stuff. There's a lot of it. You have to touch a lot of files, but it just feels kind of like you can kind of follow it all the way through. MobX, it's like, how did this component just re-render? You don't necessarily know unless you've actually looked into like how they work under the hood.
Yes, it is very much more magical, which can be frustrating when you're trying to debug a red screen or whatever. And speaking of red screens, that is another common complaint about MobX-State-Tree is that it can be a bit brittle. If you don't set your data in exactly the right way, you'll get objects die. Like you'll have objects die and then you'll get a red screen. So you just have to make sure that your setting data appropriately and keeping track of which properties you're observing or which objects you're observing, and taking care of them before you replace them, which can be a little bit finicky.
Yeah, and sometimes if you don't use it, forces you in a direction where, like, if you don't do that, it might bite you in the ass later. Because, for example, using references is something I've learned to start liking in MobX, because if you have a bunch of data and you don't have a reference to it and you start modifying that, or you add it to the tree and it's like it's the same data, it's going to complain. Or kind of what Robin was saying, where if something doesn't exist in the state tree anymore, that is going to complain, or, you have to detach this object from the tree before you can add it in another part of the state tree. I don't actually think you can have the same data in two parts of the state tree.
That's actually why I stopped using references, because sometimes you want to keep a copy of the data in more than one place, and if it has the same reference on it, then you can't do that.
Yeah.
Can you explain what a reference is to people who don't use MobX-State-Tree?
So a reference is, like, if you're familiar with relational databases, it's like a primary key. It's the guaranteed unique identifier for that object.
The ID. Yeah, right. And so instead of storing the whole object on the tree at that location, you would just store the ID. And then MobX would smartly look at it and say, oh, this is an ID. Let me go find it in the rest of the tree. And it kind of looks around until it finds that identifier and then pulls that back and lets you use that particular object.
It's good in theory, but what I've run up against in practice is that with mobile applications, you're often not dealing with a single source of truth, especially if you're getting your data from an external API. Now, if your app is a standalone and it's sort of managing its own set of data, that's a different scenario, and it might work better in that scenario. But if you're loading data from an API, especially if it's paginated, as soon as you only have a partial set, one of your references could be bad.
Yeah.
So that's what I've run into a lot with references, and that they really work better when you know you have a full set of data and you're the single source of truth.
I've gotten around that by storing the ID as, like, with a prefix. So it'd be like, maybe for a user's list, I want everybody's ID, but then for my profile, I want, profile dash my ID. And then I just store that separately. It's not ideal. It's something that I have a lot of ideas around, but I think, honestly, we could probably do a whole episode just on MobX-State-Tree. And we probably should, to be honest. I think there's some really cool stuff there.
What other libraries are there?
Well, let's talk about just hooks and context. Like, let's start with, just what's built into React. So obviously React has its own state management to some degree. There's like set state, and then it turned into use state later with hooks. They also released the new version of React Context, which allows you to share state down a whole tree of components. And I've used that. It's pretty cool. You can, obviously, hooks are kind of cool. They're kind of fun to use. They have certain rules around them, but they're not that hard to learn. And then you can just store your state right there in your component. It's right at your fingertips. There's very little code. You're ready to go. So what do you all think about just using hooks and then moving data around your components using context?
So I've never actually used just hooks and context in an app. So my first question would be, how do you persist it between app loads? Because I know with more robust state management libraries like Redux, you can take the entire state tree and plunk it in async storage and then rehydrate when the app comes back. So how would you deal with that?
I guess you would have to do it individually. And that's not ideal. So I completely agree with you. But you could obviously have a bunch of providers for every piece of state in hooks that you have that are persisting and rehydrating their own state, right? Robin, yeah, to answer your question, you would just set item, like in sort of that specific provider and like sort of use state, or like, let's say you have like a sticky state and you have like use sticky state in that reusable, like, I guess, use state function. hook, actually, the reusable hook, you could just keep persisting that specific piece of state the same way. It's just you wouldn't be able to do it in one place for everything. You would have to, it would be like everywhere, in every like hook that you have.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of hooks is that you can build these kind of modular, like your own hooks, and you can say use persisted state, and then it persists it, and then in the future just kind of loads it back in, which is kind of cool because it's sort of a hybrid between there is sort of a global place where this stuff is stored, and you can also just like, your use persisted state could just check, async storage, for example. I could just check to see if this exists. Slightly awkward though, and things like time travel wouldn't be as possible. It's actually one of the inherent problems of storing state at the leaf, at the node edge, like right in the component itself. Because this is the problem, like in a game, for example, like you have a game and you have objects, and objects work particularly well in games because it's like, okay, you have a spaceship and it has a certain amount of health and it has like a speed and a direction and whatever. So, that's fine. But then if you want to do a save game, you have to like go and collect all that data and then put it somewhere. And then when you restore, you have to then create things and like manipulate the objects into the right spots, where having like a centralized store definitely helps with that. I think one of the bigger problems with hooks and context is performance, because, if you're not careful, you'll just kind of reinvent Redux, or you'll reinvent MobX-State-Tree anyway when you're using context. And often you'll be in a position where you're re-rendering, large chunks that you don't need to re-render. It's one of the benefits of using something like MobX React, where it just monitors one particular property and will only re-render that component when it needs to. But it's definitely, you can do it, especially for smaller apps. You can definitely use hooks and context. We're pretty far into this episode. Let's keep diving through some of the other options out there. So my business partner Gant Laborde created a really cool GitHub repo called React State Museum. You should go check it out. Basically what it is, it shows one. It's sort of like To-Do MVC, where they showed like, okay, all these different to-do apps in different frameworks. This is the same idea, but it's using a packing list instead of a to-do list. Very creative. But it shows examples in React. There are links to a GitHub repo. There are links to like a code sandbox, so you can go check it out. And React Native in a lot of cases. You can check out like an Expo snack, or you can go look at the code itself. Just running through it, there's like a set state example. There's React 16 context example, what we were just talking about. Of course, there's Redux. There's MobX by itself without MobX-State-Tree. There's MobX-State-Tree, of course. And then there's unstated, which is pretty popular. I think there might be unstated next. I'm not sure.
Unstated next is what uses hooks.
Perfect. Yeah.
I don't know if it's in the State Museum, though.
Yeah. If not, like feel free to submit a pull request. Gant curates this.
Contributions, welcome.
Absolutely. You can go look at...
Hey, and Hacktoberfest is coming up.
That's right. Yes. By the time you hear this, Hacktoberfest may be already underway. So that'd be a great way to contribute. One thing we haven't talked about is using GraphQL, Apollo, Apollo link state, etc. There are examples of that on the React State Museum. I think it's a cool concept, the idea of using GraphQL. It kind of is a little bit of a throwback. It's like throwing back to server state, basically. Like we're going to store the state over there, and then we're going to just kind of seamlessly work between the server and the client side. There's also things like React Automata. Is that how you say that?
Automata? I don't know.
Automata?
What's a mata with you?
Freactal, Pure Store, React Observable Store, React Easy State, Rematch, Unistore. There are a lot of these that I actually haven't even heard of.
Yeah, I was going to say, I haven't heard of most of these. I had no idea there were so many state management libraries.
There are a ton. Immer was created by Michel, the same guy that created MobX and MobX-State-Tree. And Immer is a very interesting. We won't talk about Immer here, but it's a very interesting approach. It's definitely different than MobX. And then you can also look at lightweight versions of Redux and whatnot. And Recoil. Recoil is a new one that came out of a different part of Facebook that solves a particular type of problem, especially around like really complex interactions and whatnot. So if you had to work in a React, I think this one's probably going to be kind of obvious if you've listened to this episode, but if you had to work in a state management, you're building something, how would you make a decision and what would you choose?
I would probably look at where my data is coming from. Am I loading data from an API? How often am I loading it? Do I need to load it on every single page? Is this a healthcare app? Am I not going to be able to store data because of HIPAA? Those are all considerations. Also, am I managing my own state as a standalone app and not connecting to an API? Those are all factors. Also, just how big is the app? How much data are we going to be using? How many screens are there? If it's just a few screens, then sure, we can manage state on each individual screen using hooks and context. That's no problem. But if it's bigger than that, we're probably going to want something more robust. Does it need to scale? Also, just what is my team comfortable using?
Absolutely. That's a great list. And you can also mix and match a little bit. So if you chose MobX-State, or actually you're using MobX-State-Tree in your current project, and you showed me a component where you actually used a hook, I think, to manage the state of that component.
Yeah. So most of the time, I like to keep logic in MobX-State-Tree. But this was a case where there was a lot of logic, and it was all related to how the view was rendering. So I had 3 or 4 different use state calls all in the view layer.
What's an example of that in like the one you're talking about?
So the component I was building had basically a grid of small buttons and the ability to show more, which would display the entire list.
Sort of like a tag cloud, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you would show more to show the entire list, and then it would show a less button. So you could show less to go back to basically a single line. But the kinds of things I was keeping track of were how many total buttons were in the list and how many were visible at any given time. Let's see, what else? I had to add, because of the way the grid was laid out, I had to add some placeholder views at the end to get Flexbox to render each item correctly if there were an odd number of items. So I had to do some modulo math to get everything to come out evenly. But I did that all using hooks.
Yeah, that's cool. So you can just mix and match it in that case. Harris, same question to you. How would you kind of make a decision on what state management to use, and then what would you use?
My answer won't be as, I guess, responsible as Robin's. I would use MobX just because it makes my life easier. So, but yeah, I mean, I've tried so many state management solutions, and I think there hasn't been one I haven't regretted as much as MobX, where in the sense like not regretted, but in the sense like as the application grew, sort of I felt like, this is becoming kind of a pain, or it's tedious. Maybe it's different in large teams because I've typically worked with small teams, but maybe the next one I would want to try is either a new one. Like I guess I would either do MobX or a new one, but I wouldn't try anything other than that I've tried already, again, other than MobX.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also what your team is used to. Although we've actually had a lot of success converting Redux people over to MobX-State-Tree. That hasn't seemed to be a major problem, mainly because MobX-State-Tree makes MobX more like Redux. So it just kind of, there's a lot of familiar concepts. Yeah, and I would echo that. And certainly from a business owner perspective, when I'm looking at it, Redux is an obvious choice because there are so many Redux savvy engineers out there, and there's so much like third-party support and stuff. But MobX-State-Tree is probably like, and MobX itself they're definitely the solid runner-up in that category. And I would say probably 10% of React Native projects probably use MobX-State-Tree. I know when I'm giving those talks, I ask, and it's usually like 80% use Redux, 10% use MobX-State-Tree, and 10% are like everything else, including just using hooks and context. There's a lot of unstated in there too, but unstated has some limitations. That's why they're kind of coming out with unstated next. But yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a new section of the podcast. We are going to go into our fun part, and that is weird bugs. So weird bugs is it's a section where we just talk about weird bugs that we've encountered ourselves, or we've heard other people talk about, or we've just noticed in the wild. Not everybody's going to have a weird bug every single time that we do these episodes, but who's got a weird bug this time around?
Yeah, so I think it was yesterday or the day before, one of our teammates pointed out that there was a PR to React Navigation fixing a bug where an event listener was added in using useEffect, but then when the component was unmounted, not only was the listener not removed, it was actually added again.
So they were returning. So useEffect, the way that this works is you give it a function which like sets things up. A lot of times listeners or whatever, observers. And then you can return a function that will tear that down. It will remove those listeners, etc. This wasn't doing that, right? It was adding it again.
Yeah. So it uses useEffect to add an event listener from the React Native Dimensions API. But then useEffect was adding the listener again when the component unmounted. So that was not a great bug, but luckily this PR was changing it to remove the event listener rather than adding it again. So that's good.
So the more that your application would run in React Navigation, and there were window dimensions changing to some degree, the more listeners you would pile up, and the more often, if a change happened, it would just run this function, the onChange function, over and over and over and over again. Maybe who knows how many times.
Which is a bit of a memory leak.
Exactly.
So update React Navigation if you're using it.
Yeah, they did merge in this 3 days ago. I don't know what version it has made it into, if any yet. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's just proof that even the authors of our favorite libraries are not immune to little stuff like this.
Totally.
We're all human.
Very cool. Well, thanks to everybody who's listening. Thanks to my company, Infinite Red, for making this episode possible. Very excited. This is the second episode since we relaunched the new React Native Radio. And of course, thanks, Robin. Thanks, Harris, for being with me today. Hopefully, Aditi will be back next time so we can get her perspective. And I'm also working on some really cool guests. So stay tuned because the guests are going to be awesome. There's going to be some new people that have not been heard on this podcast before. And that's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.